Welcome to the China in the World podcast, a series of discussions examining China's foreign policy and shifting engagement with the world. The China in the World podcast is brought to you by Carnegie China and hosted by me, Paul Haenle. Welcome back to the China in the World podcast. For the 200th episode, I'm looking back at interviews conducted over the last 10 years, highlighting discussions with scholars and experts from around the world, including many of my colleagues at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace and Carnegie's 6 global centers, conducted both online and at our office in Beijing. In these discussions, we've covered a range of issues, including Chinese foreign policy, geopolitics, U.S. China relations, China-Russia relations, China's regional relations, challenges on the Korean Peninsula, and a range of many, many more foreign policy topics. I hope our listeners enjoy this episode and tune in again next month for another China in the World anniversary episode. Enjoy. The next recording comes from an interview in January 2014 with Tsinghua professor Dr. Tang Xiaoyang about growing China-Africa relations.
Some African governments and citizens are now more critical of some of the negative consequences of Chinese investment and aid in Africa. Chinese companies are finding themselves addressing environmental concerns, calls for greater corporate social responsibility, higher worker safety and product quality standards, and compliance with local labor regulations. Can you give us a sense of what efforts private Chinese companies are taking to address these concerns, and what the Chinese government will do to ensure that they're providing more benefit to African development and the African people in its engagement with these nations in Africa?
I think it's true that China has attracted a lot of criticism from Africa. But I think this can be seen from 2 perspectives. First, this is based on the nature of Chinese engagement in Africa. Because China, they have been working in this labor-intensive and this low end of the industrial value chain during the past decades. So that's why these labor environment issues are so serious in China itself. In the U.S., people work in office, people work on Apple, on Facebook. This do not produce any pollution. But it's because the U.S. they outsourced their labor-intensive and polluting industries to China. So that's why in China, people now are complaining about the pollution, about the low wage, about the sweatshop. China, they realize their own environmental problem and labor problem, their wage are also rising. So therefore, they are trying to outsource this part of industry to Africa. This actually then brings some of the problems to Africa. But that's actually exactly also the chance for Africa's industrialization. Because without this low-end jobs, then Africa cannot immediately jump into the Apple or jump into the iPhone production, because that's according to the history of world development. People need to start from these low-end jobs. And this is actually a chance for the development of poor countries, but certainly it meanwhile also brings some impact, negative impact on the original environment and the society. The second point is about the cultural difference between China and Africa, because the Chinese companies, they do not understand the African cultural and the customs very well. And they just started to go out recently. So they definitely need to understand the social context and other people's culture and tradition. Because to understand such culture, you cannot just read some books or just watch TV. You actually need to really work on the ground and to communicate with people. And for Chinese government or for the scholars, we think what the Chinese companies should do is avoid being arrogant, go to the ground and try to understand, to listen to the African opinions carefully, and to work with the Africans together.
The next recording comes from an interview in January 2015 with Dr. James Acton, co-director of the Carnegie Nuclear Policy Program.
And you wrote an op-ed in the New York Times that mentioned that the most recent defense white paper put out by China for the first time did not mention no first use. Do you see any correlation with the development of this, the research by the U.S. into these kind of systems and changing slight shifts in doctrine by the Chinese?
Well, I mean, let me tell you about one of the responses to my op-ed from General Yao Yunzhu at the Academy of Military Sciences. And I haven't got it in front of me, so I apologize if I misquote her slightly, but what she said is China has consistently upheld its no first use doctrine, and it's not going to change it. But then she said, we do have concerns, and we are concerned about, in particular, the combination of conventional advanced weapons with ballistic missile defense. And we do have a fear that these two could be used together so that the US could disarm China's nuclear forces and the US wouldn't need to use nukes in the process. So I think there is a relationship between the development of these US capabilities and concerns within China that lead to some debate within China about no first use.
The next recording comes from a September 2015 interview with Dr. Evan Medeiros, Georgetown professor and non-resident scholar at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. We discussed Xi Jinping's state visit to the United States.
If we look today at the U.S.-China relationship, we're in a complicated moment. There are frictions in the South China Sea. There are frictions on the cyber issue. There are areas of cooperation that are not, I would argue, not achieving their potential. Some scholars have recently called for a revision of our China policy, said that relations are at a tipping point. Do you agree with these assessments? And how would you view the long-term health of the U.S.-China relationship and our ability to manage both the enhancement of cooperation, but also, and perhaps more importantly, managing the friction in the relationship?
It's a great question, and it's something that I spent a lot of time thinking about during my time at the NSC and during our meetings here in Beijing this week. I don't believe that we're at a tipping point. I think that you rightly pointed out we're in a complex period in the U.S.-China relationship. But in my experience, we're always facing a complex time in the U.S.-China relationship simply because this is a relationship defined by both cooperation and competition, and both elements are intensifying in recent years. So the important goal in China policy is to manage that cooperation and competition, to ensure greater levels of cooperation, to elicit that from China, to encourage that using both incentives and disincentives, while at the same time bounding the disagreements, bounding the competition, so that doesn't become the defining elements of the relationship. And I think that is the core policy challenge, because I think there is wide agreement among specialists in the United States that we want to avoid inevitable rivalry between the United States and China. A final factor to keep in mind in assessing the future of the relationship is that this is a highly resilient relationship. We're in year 7 of the Obama administration, not year 1. The channels of communication across the relationship are broader and deeper than they've ever been before. We know the Chinese and they know us. We also have built up a very solid track record. The U.S. and China over the last 7 years have worked through some difficult issues. We have resolved crises, and we have a good track record of working together to solve important problems. North Korea's nuclear program, Iran's nuclear program, climate change, etc. So I think that fundamentally this relationship over the next 18 months under the Obama administration will continue to be a constructive one.
The next recording comes from an interview in April 2015 with Yukon Huang, Senior Fellow in the Carnegie Asia Program, on debates about China's economy. So my first question is China dealing with a debt crisis, or rather a property-related financial deepening?
Most analysts and the media look at China's rising debt levels. It's soared by 50% of GDP, 80% of GDP over the last 5 to 6, 7 years. When you look at the past history of what's going on globally, every country where the debt to GDP ratio has increased that rapidly has all crashed. Mm-hmm. So it's a very easy assumption to say, why not China? And here I'd like to say China is different. Why is it different? First of all, its soaring debt, which began around 2008, 2009, was the result of a deliberate government stimulus program, the injection of about $600 billion into the economy, largely through the financial system. It was not the consequence of years of financial or fiscal mismanagement. It was not the consequence of deteriorating balance of payments. It was a government intention. And the second thing that happened during that time is that China's property market, the private property market, really began to take off. We have to realize that private property in China 15 years ago did not exist. And then it slowly developed. Just about the time of the global financial crisis, a serious private property market began to emerge in China. When you have all this credit in the system, a lot of it shows up in buying and transfer of property. And this is also showing up in the debt indicators. This is not the normal kind of a debt crisis that we see in other kinds of countries.
The next recording comes from an interview with Andrew Weiss, Vice President of Studies and Head of the Russia-Eurasia Program at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace in March 2017.
And you talk in the report, and I think it's a very important part of the report, about the gap in the perspectives between Washington and Moscow on why there's been this breakdown in relations. Can you talk about what the gap is and why it's dangerous?
Well, I think with the Russian side of it, we since at least 2013, 2014 have now seen an emboldened Russian approach to international affairs, where sort of springing surprises, invading Ukraine, annexing Crimea, deploying military forces in Syria, interfering in the U.S. election. That's kind of the calling card of this much more risk-taking, emboldened Russian foreign policy. On the Russian side, looking at the United States, I think we see great allergy to the United States as a source of direct threat to the Russian regime, fear that the core goal of U.S. foreign policy is regime change in Russia, and a sense that U.S. unilateralism is a dangerous thing. And so anything that one could do on the Russian side to interfere with that, to slow down the U.S. onslaught, is seen as a net plus for Russia. And then at the end of the day, having a dysfunctional, messy U.S., which is discredited in the world, which has its core alliance relationships disrupted, that's also a net plus for Russia right now.
The next recording comes from a discussion in December 2017 in Beijing with Jake Sullivan, who at the time was a senior fellow in the Carnegie Geoeconomics and Strategy Program. Currently, Jake is the National Security Advisor to President Biden.
Jake, my first question is, why this new program at the Carnegie Endowment? Why this Geoeconomics and Strategy Program? What is it that you and Bill Burns, saw as a gap in terms of our foreign policy and our national economic interests?
Well, there are two basic realities out there today that motivated Bill and myself and my colleagues in the program, including Salman Ahmed and others, to launch this new geoeconomics and strategy program. The first fact is a foreign policy fact, and it's that power in the world is increasingly being measured and exercised in economic terms. And other significant countries in the world, including China, see economic power as a core part of their statecraft, as a core part of their national security strategy. And the question for the United States is, what could we be doing differently to advance our national security objectives through the use of economic influence and economic tools? The second fact, and this is something that I felt both in government but even more acutely working on the campaign for Hillary Clinton, is that the core challenge facing the United States and other advanced economies is how we strengthen and sustain the vitality of the middle class. And there has been a gap, in my view, between the way that we think about our foreign policy priorities and the things we do abroad and delivering a stronger, healthier middle class at home. And so the second question we'll be looking at is, how can we take steps in terms of our foreign policy and national security strategy that puts the middle class at the center of our decision making? And that's a major project we're looking at over the course of this year.
The next recording comes from an interview with Penny Pritzker, former U.S. Secretary of Commerce and current chair of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, from January 2018.
To do this job, you came from 27 years of running businesses into the government bureaucracy. How was that adjustment, and what were some of the difficulties? What are some of the things that actually, frankly, were easy going from private into the public sector?
Well, first of all, the toughest thing were the acronyms. Everybody spoke in, a few letters, and I had no idea what people were talking about. So but fortunately, I wasn't shy about saying, I have no idea what that means. Can you explain it to me? Right. But seriously, on day one, I tried very hard to listen to our stakeholders and understand what was important to them, what were their priorities, because it's not the job for the secretary to decide the priorities. It's the job of the secretary to help the administration understand what the American business community and what our economy would need in order to help, for the benefit not just of our businesses, but for our American workforce and for
so
Americans.
Having that 27 years of experience was invaluable
because it gave me insight into what it's really like out there.
Right. And how you could help.
How we could be helpful. But frankly, I went on a listening tour. We went to 8 different parts of the country in the first 100 days and listened. We did roundtables. I met in the first 100 days, met with over 400 CEOs to hear of different size companies, everything from bicycle manufacturers to the head of GE, to understand to the technology companies, what are their issues. And that helped us then create our priorities and develop a strategic plan. And it helped give confidence to the breadth of talent at the Department of Commerce to say, this is what our constituency wants us to be working on. And, working on a skilled workforce, that was an issue I heard from businesses of all sizes. Working on trade agreements. Businesses of all sizes said, we need trade agreements. We're struggling with our supply chain, or we're struggling to get market access. So it was, and they wanted tax reform, which we were unable to get done. But they recognized that we had a non-competitive tax structure. So, they helped to identify what are the priorities for us. And, I was really gratified. Just last week, one of the senior career professionals said to me, told one of my colleagues actually, that they said our strategic plan was the most effective work that she had done in her 40 years of government. And she felt that her work was more impactful because she knew we were all moving in the same direction.
The next recording comes from a conversation with William J. Burns in June 2018. Burns is the former president of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. He is currently serving as the director of the Central Intelligence Agency.
Those challenges between the United States and China, we're dealing with those at a time where there seems to be in the United States a recalibration of our approach to China, a reconsideration. Some have contended that our policy previous to this time was based on a belief that as we engaged China through engagement, constructive engagement, China would begin to look more like the United States, either whether we're talking about its economic system or its political system. You lived through that period in your time as a diplomat. what is that the right narrative? Did we really? I mean, were those hopes there? Did we get this wrong? And what aspects of our China policy, if needed to be recalibrated now, what aspects do you think need to be recalibrated?
Well, first, I mean, I've never assumed that China was going to develop and emerge to be just like the United States. China, as you well know, is a huge, proud, millennia-old society. And so I think what did surprise a lot of people, including me, was the pace with which China developed its economy and developed its geopolitical weight over the last 25 or 30 years. But having said that, the challenge before us today is how best do you adapt to that rise? In a sense, how best do you help shape it? It's not about containing China. And I think what that means is, an honest conversation between the United States and China, but not only between the United States and China, with lots of other players like the European Union and Japan who share some of the same concerns about access to different sectors of the Chinese economy, about the ways in which China, in its own long-term self-interest, ought to adjust. It's no longer a developing country. It's become, one of the most significant economies on the globe today. And so having that kind of an honest conversation, I think, is going to be crucially important right now. And for the United States also to recognize in its China policy that we have significant strengths on which to draw. There are lots of other countries who share a concern about some aspects of Chinese behavior, whether it's on trade and investment, where we ought to be making common cause with the European Union, rather than engaging what in effect is a second front trade war over steel and aluminum. There are lots of countries across Asia and the Pacific who share some concerns, not so much about China's rise, but about how it may throw its weight around. The United States has alliances, it has coalitions that it can draw upon, which can, in a sense, help shape China's rise so that its rise benefits the security and prosperity, not just of China itself, but of the United States and, significant players across Asia and the Pacific. That's a formidable task. I don't underestimate it. But I think we, at our own peril, underestimate the strengths that we can bring to bear. First and foremost, alliances and partners with whom we can make common cause on a lot of these issues, even as we try to build the kind of honest, respectful dialogue with China that's important to both of us.
The next recording comes from an interview with the director of Carnegie India, Rudra Chaudhuri, from a panel on China-India relations in May 2019.
Rudra, yesterday on our panel, you talked about issues where you saw challenges between China and India, but they also represent opportunities. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about those going forward in the relationship.
So Srinath touched upon the BRI and Indian concerns around the BRI. And I think, on both sides, there needs to be a lot more thinking about what the BRI means, not in general, but to the Sino-Indian relationship. So if you take the BRI into two parts, for instance, one part is, of course, this large one called CPEC, the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor. And then I think I should just say, as I mentioned in the panel yesterday, is that CPEC for India is a complete kind of no-go area. Right? There is no way in which India is going to be convinced, at least at this point of time, or any point of time really, to kind of buy into Chinese investments or China's push in what is essentially disputed territory. And these arguments go back a long way. They go back to the early 1960s. So these are not new arguments, and no one in China should be surprised by these arguments. Having said that, on the BRI in its sense, I think there are two key points that are important. One is a lot of Indian criticism of the BRI, I think, has been understood on the Chinese side as nationalism in a sense, and it's also been understood as proactively being anti-Chinese. But if you take a step back and look at what those criticisms are, in actual fact, the first set of statements made by India in 2017 after the first Belt and Road Forum, in fact, mimicked a lot of the language that was also in the EU statement, for instance, where India picked on exactly the issues that Sheena talked about on environment, sustainability, transparency, the importance of multilateralism, to have complete openness when it comes to contracts and open bidding system, for instance. So I think in terms of standards, the BRI needs to get to a place where India can start appreciating an open and free system before it even considers, at some level down the line, many years down the line, joining the system. But underneath that, there is a lot that can be done, right? So if we just take the BRI label and the BRI branding out of the picture, for instance, I think my own sense would be that India would welcome Chinese investments inside of India. There is a dire need for infrastructural support inside of India. India appreciates, I think, Chinese technology, its ability to build large infrastructure. So there, I think, in a sense, it's not that you're knocking on an open door, but I think a door could be opened if you do knock. But the way you position this is going to be very important.
The next clip comes from an October 2019 discussion with Alexander Gabuev, director of Carnegie Russia Eurasia Center, on the key elements in China-Russia relations.
Well, in that context, with frozen relations with the West in general, and an approach to the non-West. So you're doing Russia's doing more in the Middle East. I noticed that Putin met with a number of leaders from Africa recently. I want to turn to Alex. This must, in your view, what impact does that have on the Russian view of the importance at this particular juncture of its relations with China? We see a growing relationship clearly in a number of fronts: political, economic, technological. The relationship is now defined as a comprehensive strategic partnership on the
for the new era.
For the new era, on the 70th anniversary of bilateral ties. How would you describe the importance of China now, given the context that Dimitri has laid out?
I think there are three elements that define this relationship regardless of the context and of America's action. Number one is the security at the border. That's the longest continental border that China has with any country. That's the second longest border after Russia's border with Kazakhstan, which is not a real border. So both countries have been in confrontation. They have invested into protection of this border, and they know that confrontation is very dangerous and very expensive. Once they settle the territorial issue and demilitarize this border, the formula in the relationship is not always with each other, but never against each other. That's pillar one. Pillar two is the mutual compatibility of the economies. Russia has abundance of natural resources, needs investment and infrastructure. China is the opposite. And then three are similarities in the political systems. So these three elements are there, but Russia is discovering that China is really playing a very important role in this part of the world, driving demand for commodities, and is actually a power that can balance Russia's at least economic outreach to the outside world and lessen its dependency on Europe. So in an ideal world, you would have Russia standing on two legs, or representing a coat of arms, the double-headed eagle, which looks both east and west. And Russia, as an exporter, which is all about commodities, could send its commodities westward to the European Union and then eastward to China and hopefully other players in Asia. But then the sanctions came in, and I think that the role of China as a market for Russian commodities, as source of advanced technology to replace Western technology, and a source of capital, is increasingly visible. So these are the three areas where Russia really needs China on the economic front.
The next interview is from a May 2020 discussion on the coronavirus and the Korean Peninsula with Dr. Zhao Tong, Senior Fellow at Carnegie China and the Carnegie Nuclear Policy Program.
But we are facing new problems, which is the growing U.S. China bilateral rivalry. Both countries, as a result of that, care more about preserving or expanding their own geopolitical influence in this region. In China, when many strategists, they see the U.S. stepping up tensions against China, blaming China on a wide range of issues, they may start to think that North Korea that is defiant may help distract the attention of the United States away from China.
The next audio clip comes from the same conversation on the coronavirus and the Korean Peninsula with Chung Min Lee, Senior Fellow in Carnegie's Asia program.
Chung Min, it's been my sense since my time working on this in the government
that the U.S. and South Korea have been pretty aligned, both in terms of the analysis and in terms of the approach. Good open flow of communication between the two allied countries. And so I want to get your sense of how you see South Korea viewing the challenge and the approach that it would work best. But I do know, Tong Zhao talked about the blame in China toward the U.S. for the current deadlock, and that one of the features was a disagreement over whether or not we should give North Korea some sanctions relief at this point. The Trump administration does not believe it should, doesn't think North Korea has done anything to deserve that, and believes that the maximum pressure is the right approach. It seems South Korea may share China's view more on this issue. And so, if you could also, unpack that a little bit for us.
Yeah, sure, Paul. I think one of the most important points we've got to, agree upon is North Korea already has nuclear weapons. She's conducted 6 nuclear tests with ICBM capabilities. And so she is not just a threat to South Korea, but to regional stability on the whole. And so the idea that North Korea is going to give up nuclear weapons through multilateral negotiations has been the working norm for the last 3 decades. And North Korea's nuclear tests have basically debunked that assumption as far as I'm concerned. We must always strive for diplomacy because none of us wants conflict or war. But we must also realize that diplomacy must be based on realistic assumptions. And that assumption went out the window when North Korea became a de facto nuclear weapon state as far as I'm concerned.
In an April 2020 interview, Evan Feigenbaum, Vice President for Studies and head of the Asia program at the Carnegie Endowment, shares his insights on the dynamics preventing U.S. China cooperation on global challenges.
And so the question is, in the places where there still are complementary, even if there aren't common interests, can the United States and China find ways to make the international system workable in a functional sense? Because if they can't, and I think that's what's happened in this pandemic, and you've seen that, then that leaves a lot of other countries and a lot of other actors in the lurch. In other words, if the 2 countries that have basically led globalization for the last 25 years aren't prepared to either act to defend it or are not prepared to lead collective responses, then everybody else is going to have to figure out what to do about that. And I think in other areas like the trade area, where, if you look at trade rules in Asia, which are now set by the Trans-Pacific Partnership, an agreement that includes neither the United States nor China, there is a precedent for third parties to start to step up, set standards, develop norms, write rules themselves, and then try to backfoot the United States and China and leave them as the spoilers, individually or jointly, of meaningful collective action. And I think that's what I'm interested to see coming out of this pandemic. Basically, nobody can match American power, capacity, and capability. Meanwhile, on the Chinese side, it's the fastest rising player, and in large swaths of the global south or the developing world, it's actually a bigger and more significant player than the United States. But in terms of leading collective international responses to genuinely transnational problems, if those 2 aren't going to coordinate, then I just think there are a lot of countries around the world that are not simply going to accept that. And as in my PPP example, it's different than in a pandemic. I think on issue-specific areas and in a very ad hoc way, you'll start to see variable coalitions of countries forming in ways that are going to really raise the bar for both American and Chinese foreign policy to try to navigate their way through that much more complex international relational system.
In the next interview from January 2021, Karim Sadjadpour, senior fellow in Carnegie's Middle East program, discusses China's growing role in the Middle East.
As the U.S. kind of reduces its presence in the region, which creates a vacuum for outside powers to fill that vacuum, I think it is inevitable that China is going to play more of a role in filling some of these vacuums, and it's going to get entangled in the politics of the region in different ways. Let me give you a couple examples. Number one is that we have seen in the last couple of weeks or so that China has been outspoken in talking about justice for the Palestinians and criticizing the U.S. approach towards the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, despite the fact that China itself has very close relations with Israel. So it's kind of getting more involved in one of the region's most contentious issues.
In a June 2021 interview, Rosa Balfour, director of Carnegie Europe, shares her insights on the EU's role in navigating U.S. China relations.
With respect to China, and I think perhaps let's just focus on this somewhat, I think there are two issues. The first is that the EU it's been jerked into a greater awareness about the type of challenges and opportunities that China poses to Europe. So we have come from a decade or more in which Europe viewed China principally through business lens as a large, great economic opportunities. This was driven by the belief that China would be socialized into the international system, into the multilateral system, which was in the interests of the EU. Then with the Trump years, Trump has been posing black and white questions, either with us or without us. That is something the EU does not appreciate. We have precedents of this, for instance, 2003 with Iraq. The EU prefers a much more nuanced position, but it also raised awareness of a certain dimension of the challenges that China poses to Europe. And so Europe has been changing its policy basically since 2019. So where do things stand now? The first point is the degree to which the US is willing to accept that the EU is likely to always have a nuanced policy towards China and any other actor, and that it's not going to embrace black and white language about international relations. It does not see geopolitics in terms of great power rivalry. That's not how the EU plots itself on the global map. So that is the first point. The second, however, is that we're seeing greater awareness of the several challenges that China is bringing about, and the challenges that the Trump years brought about. And both these are pushing the EU in a direction which is focusing a bit more intensely on what are its core strategic interests, what can it achieve alone, there's a whole new debate on Europe's strategic autonomy.
The next interview from May 2022 features Amr Hamzawy, director of Carnegie's Middle East program. We discussed China's growing role in the Middle East.
How do countries in your view, countries in the region, is there a desire for China to play a greater diplomatic and security role in the region, especially as the United States moves to try to do offshore balancing, as Bill Hari talked about?
So let me respond quickly by saying yes. We can classify Middle Eastern countries fall in two groups. A group which has traditionally tried to engage China more with regard to Middle Eastern conflicts. This group has included countries like Algeria, Egypt, pre-Arab Spring, Libya, Syria, and so on and so forth. And this group still has two active diplomatic powers in the Middle East, Algeria and Egypt, and they continue to push for greater Chinese engagement.
In the next interview from July 2022, Darshana Baruah, fellow at Carnegie's South Asia program, discusses the strategic importance of the Indo-Pacific region.
And in terms of Vice Admiral Dasgupta's comments with regard to China's presence in the Indian Ocean, I mean, how do you see that? Would you have answered it that way yourself, or do you believe that China's presence does represent certain challenges to India?
I do think China's challenges represent a few some challenges to India, but from an Indian military point of view, both if you were to do the continental, like say the land border versus the maritime border, the Indian Navy is in a little bit more advantageous position vis-a-vis China at sea than it's at land, simply because of geography, right? Even though the Indian Army gets more of the defense budget, it is the Navy which is better equipped, especially in terms of operational capabilities and experience to engage with with the Chinese Navy in the Indian Ocean region. So I think traditionally, even like you wouldn't hear publicly where India acknowledges or recognizes that it is a growing problem. They recognize that it's a development in the horizon, but not that it presents a direct threat, because that answer is measured against one thing, essentially. That answer is measured, that one thing is like the red line. Is India able to engage with military conflict in the Indian Ocean region and still secure its position? And that answer is yes at this point in time, because India is based in the Indian Ocean and China still has quite a few capability gaps and geographical disadvantages, right? So from that point of view, Vice Admiral Dasgupta saying that it's not a challenge is essentially saying that should tomorrow there be conflict, we'll still come out of it victorious.
In the next interview from November 2022, Dr. Ian Chong, non-resident scholar at Carnegie China and professor at the National University of Singapore, speaks about U.S. China relations after the 2022 U.S. midterm elections.
We also have to recognize the fact that whether it's one country, two systems, so it's tied to the 92 consensus, it has no market in Taiwan. It's just tremendously unattractive. And so when, sure, Beijing will rattle the sabers and express its unhappiness, that may prevent, move towards de jure independence. And certainly most Taiwanese, they want the status quo, and they want to keep it, whether they eventually want independence or unification, they want the status quo now. And I think that suggests a unattractiveness of China and the Chinese system to people in Taiwan. And if that does not get resolved, then the stalemate is here to stay, and the sort of efforts to sort of elbow around will happen, and there's going to be more potential for escalation, for accidents to happen.
The next recording comes from January 2023, featuring Ashley Tellis, Tata Chair for Strategic Affairs at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. In this discussion, we talk about China-India relations.
And the fact that there was a loss of life, I think, changed India's attitudes to China. And I think the assumption there, at least as I read it in Delhi, was that China had changed its basic strategy towards India. China had become conscious of its own power and therefore did not feel the need to be as respectful of Indian equities as it was in the past. I think there's also the sense, and I hear this from the Chinese side, that China felt that India and the United States were getting a tad too close for Chinese comfort. Whatever the motivations were, the bottom line is this, that the events of May 2020 really transformed India's attitudes to China. And all the hopeful developments that you flagged, the sort of episodic exchanges between the two leaders at various multinational meetings, the broad convergence that both countries have on various multilateral issues. None of these, in my judgment, has fundamentally transformed the deep Indian suspicion of China that exists today.
The next recording comes from the 4th Carnegie China Global Dialogue Series of 2023, in which Dan Baer, Senior Vice President for Policy Research and Director of the Europe Program at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, discusses China-EU relations after the Ukraine war.
I mean, if I were giving advice to the CCP, one of the things that I would point out is that from a European perspective, it reasonably looks like China is willing to let Russia be the demolition agent for the international system, while China waits to build in its place a international system that is more reflective of Chinese desires. And that is a real strategic move against Europe, because it is against the international system that is grounded in universal values that Europe depends on, and that Europe has been a chief champion of and has invested a great deal in. And in that respect, China's support for Russia is not just approximate support for a particular war that is ongoing in Europe, but also a more global systemic attack on a system that Europe sees as fundamental to its long-term prosperity and security.
Thank you for listening to the China in the World podcast. For more episodes and research, please go to carnegiechina.org. This episode was produced by Nathaniel Schur with assistance from Creighton Arrington, Lin Kai Zhao, and Nicole Weinraub. The music was composed by Spencer Barnett.